So I'll be presenting some work in progress that I'm doing with my advisor, Dieter. So in computational complexity, we have these two resources that are really important, right? Randomness and nondeterminism. And usually, when we talk just about randomness, the question we ask is, can randomized algorithms be simulated deterministically? One specific question we might ask here is P equal to BPP, right? If we stick some nondeterminism into this question, we get, can interactive proofs be simulated nondeterministically, right? And if we're just focusing on the constant round ones, there are essentially two choices here, right? Either we first have nondeterminism and then randomness, and in that case, we're asking, is NP equal to MA? Or first, this is implied by derandomizing BPP, right? So if we can derandomize BPP, then we can derandomize MA, right? So in my opinion, the more interesting case is when we first have randomness and nondeterminism, and then the question is NP equal to AM? And this one, we don't know if it is implied by a derandomization of promised BPP. And indeed, there's evidence that points toward all of these equalities being true, right? All of the ones in the slide. So what type of evidence is this? It's these hardness versus randomness trade-offs, right? So very simple. If hard functions exist, then we can derandomize, right? And the idea is to use this hard function to instantiate a pseudo-random generator or a hidden set generator, right? So it looks like this. We have our algorithm A with input X, and it receives some random bits as well. And we replace the random bits by a pseudo-random string produced by a pseudo-random generator that has access to this hard function f, right? And then the idea is, as long as this function is hard, then the output of this generator is good and fools any efficient algorithm, right? And the way we prove that these are correct is usually through this reconstructive paradigm, where we have, if it's in the contrapositive, if the output of my generator is not pseudo-random, then the function is easy. Usually this means it's computable by small circuits, right? And the idea here is to take this distinguisher that is not fooled by the algorithm and use it to build a circuit that computes the hard function f, right? And so we have here our algorithm A with input X, and it's a bad input, right? The generator fails to fool A with input X. We put it in a little box and call it our distinguisher. And now we feed this into this reconstruction algorithm, R, along with any extra information that we might need, and it spits out a small circuit for the function. So here, if we just care about the circuit complexity of the function, all we care about is the size of the circuit C. We may also care about the complexity of the reconstruction R in case we are in the uniform setting, as well as the complexity of obtaining any of these extra information. And finally, we call such a reconstruction learning if this extra information, this extra advice, consists only of evaluations of the function. And I'll be mentioning a couple of generators today, and all of them are learning, right? So that's why our approach is going to work for them. Okay, so for BPP specifically, let me see if I can. Well, for BPP, we've seen earlier today that non-uniform lower bounds and black box derandomization are fully equivalent, right? And at least in some settings of parameters, we have a full equivalence between uniform lower bounds and average case derandomization, at least at the very low end, right? And, there's this question, what if just BPP equals P? And this was addressed by Ligi and Rowe from the earlier presentation, right? They identified this new type of lower bound that is implied by BPP equals P and also implies it, right? So this lower bound, you already know, it's of the type almost all inputs, right? And the specific result, simplified here, that they prove is first, in this direction, if we can derandomize BPP, then there exists this hard function that is computable by uniform circuits, right? In the other direction, if there is this hard function, but now it's computable by shallow circuits, then, and it's hard for probabilistic algorithms on almost all inputs, then we can de-randomize promised BPP. Right? So the only actual gap here is the depth of the circuit. Right? It needs to be shallow for the de-randomization result, and it's not necessarily shallow when we go from de-randomization to hardness. Okay, so how are these almost all input lower bounds to de-randomization results proven? They're proven using these targeted PRGs and HSGs. The way I viewed them, at least in this work, is as follows, right? So again, we have this algorithm A. We want to de-randomize with input X and random bits. And now we substitute the random bits, again by pseudo-random bits, but the generator receives the input X as part of its input as well, right? So it produces a pseudo-random string that I'm calling row X that is targeted to de-randomizing A with input X. Right? And then the idea is, if my function f is hard to compute on input X, then the output of the generator with input X is pseudo-random, and thus we can de-randomize algorithm A on input X. Right? So it's this input by input. That's where the title of the talk comes from. Okay, so when we talk about the same landscape for AM, the non-uniform case is essentially solved, right? So we have this full equivalence. And the uniform case is a bit more complicated, right? So we have results in both directions, but in none of the settings we have an actual equivalence between uniform lower bounds and de-randomization in the pseudo setting, which is similar to the average case setting for BPP, where you just efficient algorithms can't find errors in the simulation with high probability. So, okay, again, we may ask, what if just AM is equal to NP, right? And that's the question that we address. We fill essentially the same gap for AM equals NP, right? So we identified that these almost all input lower bounds follow from AM equals to NP, and that a de-randomization of AM also follows from these types of lower bounds. Okay, so I can talk a bit more about these. I'll just talk about some earlier results on de-randomization of AM. Right? So in the non-uniform case, there are three notable results that I'll talk about. First one is by Clivens and Dieter, and it essentially uses this property of the Nissan-Wigderson generator that it relativizes. And so if you assume hardness against set oracle circuits, then you can de-randomize AM, right? And it works for the entire de-randomization spectrum. So you can get from the low end to the high end. Right? Little later, Miltersen and Vinochandran developed what I'll call the MV generator. And this time, you only need to assume hardness against non-deterministic, more specifically single-valued circuits. But it has a drawback that it only works for the high end. Okay. And then finally, there's this result by Chaltiel and Humans, who developed this SU generator that, again, only requires hardness against non-deterministic circuits and works for the entire de-randomization spectrum. So it essentially provides an optimal trade-off here, as long as we don't consider any polynomial factors. Right? Like I mentioned, the uniform case is a bit more complicated. So one of the first such results is by Gutfreund, Chaltiel, and Tashma, who use the MV generator and specifically exploit a property that it has that's called resiliency. I'll get back to this later. And they showed that if you have this high-end type separation, where exp is not contained in sub-exponential AM, then you can de-randomize AM in the pseudo setting, right? And a little later, Chaltiel and Humans defined this recursive variant of the MV generator that I'm calling RMV that also has this special property. And with this, they managed to push this result a little more to the low end, right? So assuming this separation between exp and a quasi-polynomial AM, then you can get a weaker de-randomization of AM. Notice that what we actually want is X not contained in AM, right? That would be ideal to get such a weak de-randomization. Okay, so what do our results look like, right? So first, if we can de-randomize AM, then we can show there exists functions that are computable by shallow, uniform, non-deterministic circuits, with the caveat that they have a few bits of advice, and this function is hard for AM on almost all inputs. On the other direction, let me just mention that this is essentially diagonalization, so very similar to the Ligi and Rowe result, but we also use the Cook-Levin theorem to make this circuit low depth, right, since it's a non-deterministic circuit. And on the other direction, if we have such a hard function, right, that is computable by shallow, uniform, non-deterministic circuits, now with few non-deterministic guesses, that is hard for AM protocols, then we can de-randomize promise AM, right? So let me just mention here that they have these characteristics in common, right? So both in the hardness to pseudo-randomness and de-randomization to hardness, the circuits are shallow, uniform, and non-deterministic, right? The gap here, and the reason we have two implications, is that for the first one, the function requires a few bits of advice, and in the second one, we required that the function, even though it has non-deterministic circuits, we need to limit the number of non-deterministic guesses that it makes. And then in the hardness to de-randomization direction, we are able to extend this to a couple different settings using different generators, right? So this first one is using the MV generator, and it leads to a full de-randomization. But by using its recursive variant or the SU generator, we can push it to the lower end in the second case and to the absolute low end in the third case. But then hardness has to be against algorithms with oracle access to promise AM instead of just AM protocols. I can get back to this later if you have any specific questions. Oh.
I think as you also have a paper showing these three types of hardness assumption are equivalent. Can you use that there? Or?
These two? Or?
I mean the SAT. So I think they show that something like if E does not have select spatial size set oracle non-adaptive circuit, then it also has no non-deterministic circuit. These two assumptions are equivalent.
Yeah, but that's in the non-uniform setting, right? So like this, the
see.
single-valued circuit that they build, it needs some
I see.
Yeah. And that advice is computable in P with a promise AM oracle. Indeed, that's where it comes from.
Yeah. I see. Thanks.
Okay, so to explain. Oh.
I want to ask, you had a gap between n to the c and n to the c minus epsilon, right?
Can you say that?
You had a gap between n to the c and n to the c minus epsilon, right?
Oh, right here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that. Like, it needs to be something like, okay, you have a circuit that you can significantly speed up. And this is the way I found to, write it concisely right here.
Okay. This is in one direction. In the other direction, we also make this small gap? Or?
No, it's a little higher as well. There's like a hidden constant universal from the de-randomization. Yeah. Okay, so to explain how we prove the hardness to de-randomization result, let me just go over Ligi and Rowe's result very quickly, right? So remember, that's our starting point. We have this function computable by shallow uniform circuits. That's hard. And they use this targeted HSG construction based on the doubly efficient proof system of Goldwasser, Kalai, and Rothblum. Right? So okay, here we have our shallow circuit, right, def D. We have the inputs at the bottom and the outputs at the top. Right? So first thing we do is we consider these functions alpha that map an index j to the value of the jth gate in a particular layer. Right? And this is for a particular input x. Right? So for a particular input x in circuit, we define these functions, and then take a low degree extension of these so that we can use all of these nice properties that polynomials have. Okay, so now we have all of these polynomials, and in the actual construction there are a couple of extra layers in between that guarantee the downward self-reducibility. Those are the sum check layers, but I'll mostly be ignoring them here just for simplicity, right? But they're actually there. Okay, so we have these polynomials, and their construction essentially applies the Nissan-Wigderson generator along with a Hadamard encoding to produce a hidden set H from all of these polynomials together. Now, what about the reconstruction, right? So say we have this hidden set generator fails to hit some circuit, we have a distinguisher, and we want to run the reconstruction, right? So again, we have the polynomials, and they have this nice downward self-reducibility property. The idea is, because the first polynomial is simple, it's essentially just the input x. They have the circuit C0 that computes it. They use it together with the downward self-reduction to compute the advice that they need to build a circuit for the next polynomial, build that circuit using the Nissan-Wigderson reconstruction, plus Goldreich-Levin and some error correction for polynomials, and they keep going, right? So now they do it for the next circuit, for the next polynomial, until they get to the last one and output f of x. Right? So what changes in our case, right? So the first observation is that we can replace Nissan-Wigderson essentially by any pseudorandom generator, right? And indeed, that's what we do, right? So for the high-end result, we replace it by the MV generator, lower end by the RMV, and low end by the SU generator, right? And of course, this is the easy part. This is just computing the generator. What's a bit more complicated is the reconstruction, right? That's where most of the problems arise. For example, the SU generator, as far as we know, hasn't been used in the uniform setting so far, so we had to uniformize its reconstruction to do this. Okay, one more thing. We can go directly from the polynomials to the generators because all of these generators work directly with polynomials. We don't need to go to the binary Boolean setting using a Hadamard encoding. Okay, so what about the reconstruction, right? For now, we'll be assuming that f is computable by deterministic circuits just by simplicity, for simplicity, and later I'll get back to this. And I'll talk about the reconstruction for MV and SU because they are similar, right? So it starts essentially the same, right? We have the circuit C0 that computes the first polynomial, and we can use it together with the downward self-reduction to compute all of the advice we need to build a circuit for C1, right? And then we run the MV or the SU reconstruction and obtain the circuit C1, right? The problem now is that this is a non-deterministic circuit, so it's harder to evaluate it, right? But we only care about obtaining an Arthur-Merlin protocol, so the obvious thing to do here is to use Merlin's help. Right? And this turns out to work, right? Because for both of these generators, all of the randomness required by the reconstruction is independent of the circuits themselves. Only depends. For MV, it's easy to see that it only depends on the distinguisher. All you care about is about some property in the distinguisher. And for SU, it's not really independent, but with error reduction, that can be made to work, right? So how does the reconstruction look like in the end, right? So we have Arthur and Merlin here with access to input X. Arthur samples all of the randomness, and that's all there's needed. Construct circuit C1. Merlin sends all of the computational paths required to evaluate C1 from there on. Arthur can then construct C2. This keeps going until they get to the last circuit, and Arthur outputs f of x. Right? Of course, many messages being sent by Merlin, but they can all be sent in parallel, and we get a two-round AM protocol. Right? And for these two, we only actually use Merlin in this simple way, which is as a glorified circuit evaluator, right? We have non-deterministic circuit. We need his help to compute it, right? So what if we try going a little further, right? And that's what we do for the recursive version of MV, right? So instead of just having Merlin help us compute the advice along the way, what if he just sends it all at once, right? In a single message. What happens in that case, right? So again, we have all of these polynomials, and we have circuit C0. Right? And now because Merlin sent all of that advice, we effectively have access to circuits C1 prime to CD prime that are sent by Merlin, and they are non-deterministic. Right? Problem is, being non-deterministic, we can't really trust these circuits in principle because Merlin could construct them in a way that if he sends a computational path, they evaluate to a value, and to a different value on a different computational path. Right? And here's where we exploit this resiliency property of the RMV generator, that here, when Merlin sends all of that advice, is effectively committing to functions beta 1 to beta d. Right? So all of these circuits are actually single-valued or unambiguous. Right? And then, okay, if we now have these functions, by using low-degree testing and self-correction, we can make sure that they are close to low-degree polynomials and access these low-degree polynomials as well. And then finally, using polynomial identity testing and the downward self-reduction, we can 2 by 2 make sure that these polynomials are the correct polynomials, right? All of the alphas until we get to the last one and output f of x, right? Something subtle here is that all of this needs to be done and can be done in parallel, so we don't blow up the number of rounds in the Arthur-Merlin computation. Right? So we don't want to do this for every layer. We don't want to exchange messages for every layer. All of this can be done in parallel, and then we output f of x. And like I mentioned, up until now, function f computable by deterministic circuits, right? What if the circuits are non-deterministic? What do we do in this case? Right? First, very simple observation is that we can pull the non-determinism out, right? We can consider this two-input function, f prime, that receives the input and the non-deterministic guesses, and now it's a function computable by deterministic circuits, right? So that, if we do this, we can now use the previous result to instantiate the theorem, right? The problem is that now, when we are running the reconstruction, Arthur needs a computational path y to compute this value of f prime of x and y. Right? Not only a computational path, he needs a good one, right? And a simple solution, again, is to just have Merlin send this value together with whatever else he needs to send during the reconstruction. Right? So just have Merlin send y. Right? And indeed, this works, but it's not clear why it works. At least at first, it's not clear why it works for all three of those generators. Right? So how can we guarantee that this particular idea works? Right? So here, we identify this new resilience property that we call distinguisher resiliency. And as long as the generators we use have this property, then that idea works. Right? And this property is called distinguisher resiliency and goes like this. With high probability, the circuit output by the reconstruction is partial single-valued and correct. So partial single-valued means that its output may not be defined for every input, but for the ones it's defined, it's independent of the non-deterministic choices. It only depends on the actual input. So, Merlin can cheat using these circuits. And we want this to hold even if the distinguisher that we're giving as input to the reconstruction is a faulty distinguisher, right? Is an actual distinguisher for the reconstruction. And indeed, for MV and RMV, this property essentially follows from the original resilience property. It's not entirely straightforward, but if you understand how it works, then it follows from that property, right?
Do
For-
you need to assume the distinguisher only accept a few strings?
For NV and RMV, yes. For SU, no, you don't need that. No. So it still needs to be, a distinguisher that accepts few strings. For MV, very few. For MV, that's not necessarily just a half. No. And then for the Chaltiel-Humans generator, this requires a more involved argument. Indeed, because as far as we know, it's not resilient in the same sense as a MV and RMV are. Right? But it turns out that it has this key property, and we can use it in our results. Okay, so now just to conclude, in this setting of de-randomizing AM, we identified, that almost all inputs, lower bounds, play an important role here, and we have this almost equivalence, right? Specifically in the hardness to de-randomization direction, we show some new uniform hardness randomness trade-offs for AM. And indeed, the first such result that is in the low end, right, as long as we have some extra efficiency requirements. And we also identify this resilience property of interest and prove that all of these generators are resilient in this sense. And then, of course, the obvious open problem here is, can we turn this into an actual equivalence, right? And it may be the case that this is easier to achieve in this setting because of the power of non-determinism, right? Where we can make sure that these non-deterministic circuits are shallow by applying the Cook-Levin transformation to them. And this marks the end of the presentation. I'd like to thank you and leave it open for questions.
Do you maybe explain where the gap of n to the c versus n to the c minus epsilon came from?
So in the case of the MV generator, we can essentially only get speedups of the type, the original function is t of n. We can get t of n to 1 over delta. But then we need to t of n to delta for a small delta.
Speed up or something.
Yeah, the speed up. We go from t of n to delta. But then you have to pay n to the 1 over delta on the other side to amplify the protocol sufficiently enough. Does that make sense? Because
But I'll ask you that.
Okay,
This
yeah.
is technical.
Yeah, and then the trade-off ends up not looking that great. So to simplify it, I put d minus epsilon there just to. Any other questions?
No other questions? Let's thank you.